They laughed when Clara Whitmore married the poorest mountain man in Silver Hollow, but none of them knew he owned something the whole town had never even seen. The morning sun had barely cleared the jagged peaks when the church bell rang once, slow and hollow, echoing across the dusty main street of the little mountain town. Silver Hollow wasn't much of a place. Maybe 40 wooden buildings, a general store, a blacksmith, and a line of cabins leaning against the slopes like tired travelers. Wagons creaked along the dirt road, horses snorted in the cool air, and a thin wind carried the smell of pine and chimney smoke down from the high ridges. People gathered outside the church that morning mostly out of curiosity, not because a grand wedding was happening, but because the bride was Clara Whitmore and the groom was Elias Rowan. Clara was known in town as a steady, kind young woman who helped her father run the general store. She kept the books neat, spoke gently to travelers, and had a smile that made strangers feel welcome even after a 20-mile ride through cold mountain wind. Most folks figured she'd marry someone respectable, maybe a rancher with land or a trader who passed through every spring. But instead, she chose the quiet mountain man who lived miles above town in a weathered cabin no one had visited in years. Elias Rowan rarely came to Silver Hollow. When he did, he walked slowly down Main Street wearing the same faded coat, boots dusted with trail dirt, and a hat that had seen more winters than most men in town. He never stayed long. A sack of flour, a box of nails, sometimes a coil of rope. That was all he ever bought. He spoke little, paid in exact coins, and rode back up the mountain before sundown. The townsfolk had a name for him, whispered half as a joke and half with a shrug. The Cloud Beggar, because he lived somewhere high in the ridges where the clouds hung low in the morning. No one knew how he survived the long winters up there. No one knew where he came from either. So when word spread that Clara Whitmore planned to marry Elias Rowan, the whole town felt the same quiet disbelief. Some said she was too kind for her own good. Others figured she'd regret it before the first snowfall. But on that clear autumn morning, Clara stood at the church steps in a simple white dress while Elias waited beside her in that same worn coat. No gold ring flashed in the sunlight. No wagon full of gifts waited outside. Just the wind, the mountains, and the quiet man who barely spoke. The preacher finished the ceremony in less than 5 minutes. Elias nodded once. Clara smiled softly. And just like that, the poorest man anyone knew had a wife. A few people clapped politely. Others shook their heads. One old rancher muttered that the girl deserved better. But Elias Rowan didn't argue with anyone. He simply took Clara's hand, stepped down from the church porch, and looked toward the distant peaks rising 10,000 feet above the valley. That night, in the little cabin at the edge of town where they would stay before heading to the mountains, Elias said something that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. His voice was low, calm, almost thoughtful. "Tomorrow," he told her quietly, staring toward the dark outline of the ridges, "I'm going to take you home." The next morning the town of Silver Hollow was still quiet when Elias Rowan saddled his old bay horse behind the small cabin where he and Clara had spent their first night as husband and wife. The air carried that sharp mountain chill that comes before sunrise, when frost clings to fence posts and the ridges above town glow pale blue against the sky. Clara stepped outside with a small travel bag and paused for a moment, looking toward the mountains that rose mile after mile above the valley floor. She had lived in Silver Hollow her entire life, yet she had never gone more than a few miles into those ridges. Most people did not. The trails twisted through narrow passes, climbed steep slopes, and vanished into forests so thick the sunlight barely reached the ground. Elias tightened the saddle straps with steady hands and spoke only a few words. He told Clara the ride would be long, maybe 20 miles before nightfall. Clara did not ask questions. She simply mounted the horse behind him and wrapped her coat tighter against the cold wind rolling down the slopes. They left town just as the first light touched the rooftops. Behind them, Silver Hollow slowly disappeared into the distance, the small buildings shrinking until they looked like toys scattered across the valley. The trail climbed steadily for hours. Pine trees crowded the narrow path, their tall trunks rising like pillars into the pale morning sky. Sometimes the trail was barely wide enough for the horse to pass, hugging the edge of a steep ridge where the valley dropped hundreds of feet below. Yet Elias rode with calm certainty, as if he had traveled this path 1,000 times. Around midday, they stopped beside a clear mountain stream that spilled over smooth stones and disappeared between thick patches of moss. Elias filled a small tin cup with water and handed it to Clara. The water tasted cold and fresh, straight from the snowmelt higher in the mountains. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the quiet rush of water and the distant cry of a hawk circling far above the ridges. Clara studied her husband as he stood beside the horse. In town, he had always seemed like a man the world had forgotten, quiet and worn by the years. But up here, in the high country, something about him felt different. His eyes moved across the mountains with familiarity, as if every ridge and valley carried a memory. By late afternoon, the trail grew steeper. Thick fog drifted between the trees, and the air turned colder with every mile they climbed. Clara noticed something strange then. The path they followed did not appear on any of the old trade routes she had seen marked on maps in her father's store. This trail was narrower, older somehow, as if it had been hidden from travelers for generations. The horse climbed slowly through the mist until the trees finally began to thin. Ahead of them rose a wall of gray stone, a cliff so tall it disappeared into the clouds above. Elias guided the horse to a stop at the base of the rock face. Clara looked around, confused. The trail simply ended there. No cabin, no valley, only silent stones stretching hundreds of feet into the fog. For a long moment Elias said nothing. Then he dismounted, stepped toward the cliff, and brushed his hand across a section of rock worn smooth by time. His fingers found something hidden there, something small and cold beneath the stone. When he pulled, a faint metallic sound echoed through the mountain, deep and hollow, like a distant bell ringing somewhere inside the earth. The sound that echoed through the mountain was slow and heavy, like iron chains moving somewhere deep behind the stone. Clara felt the vibration under her boots before she fully understood what was happening. The cliff in front of them did not simply stand still anymore. Dust drifted down from thin cracks in the rock, and small pebbles rolled across the ground. Elias stepped back calmly, as if this moment was something he had been expecting all along. Clara looked from him to the towering wall of stone rising nearly 300 feet into the mist. At first nothing seemed to change. Then a narrow line appeared in the rock, a thin shadow cutting down the middle of the cliff from high above. The line slowly widened. Stone moved against stone with a deep grinding sound that echoed across the ridge and disappeared into the clouds. The mountain was opening. Clara stared in disbelief as the massive wall of rock separated into two enormous sections, each sliding slowly away from the other. The opening revealed darkness at first, a deep passage hidden inside the mountain itself. Cool air drifted outward from the gap, carrying the faint scent of pine and water. It was not the dry scent of stone that she expected. It smelled alive. Elias turned toward Clara and offered his hand, his expression calm and steady. She stepped down from the horse almost without realizing it, and walked beside him toward the widening opening in the cliff. The passage beyond was wide enough for wagons, yet no wagon tracks marked the ground. Smooth stones stretched ahead, worn as if generations had once walked this path. Light slowly appeared at the far end of the tunnel, pale and bright like the first glow of sunrise. They walked nearly 100 yards through the mountain before the passage opened suddenly into daylight. Clara stopped the moment she stepped outside. Before her stretched a valley she had never imagined could exist. The land spread wide and green beneath a sky filled with drifting clouds. Tall grass moved gently in the wind, and narrow streams wound through fields that shimmered in the afternoon light. Small wooden homes stood along the hillsides, their roofs catching the sun as smoke curled peacefully from stone chimneys. Barns, gardens, and orchards dotted the valley floor, arranged with the quiet order of a place that had been lived in for many years. Yet the most astonishing sight was the sky itself. The valley did not sit below the clouds like Silver Hollow far down the mountain. It rested above them. A sea of white mist rolled far below the surrounding cliffs, stretching across the horizon like an endless ocean. Clara felt her breath catch as she realized how high they had climbed. They were standing in a hidden world nearly 2 miles above the valley where she had spent her entire life. Elias led the horse forward along a gentle trail that curved down into the valley. As they approached the first cluster of homes, people began to appear. A woman carrying a basket paused beside a fence. A young boy stopped running across a field. A man standing near a barn slowly removed his hat. One by one, they turned toward Elias Rowan. Then something even stranger happened. The man by the barn lowered his head. The woman beside the fence stepped forward and placed her hand over her heart. Within seconds, others followed. Across the valley, doors opened and more people emerged, gathering quietly along the path. And as Elias continued walking forward, every single one of them stepped aside with the same silent respect, as if the poorest mountain man from Silver Hollow was someone they had been waiting to see for a very long time. Clara walked beside Elias in silence as they moved deeper into the hidden valley, the soft grass bending under their boots while the cool wind carried the scent of pine, fresh water, and distant orchards. The people who had stepped aside along the trail did not speak loudly or rush toward them. Instead, they watched quietly with calm expressions, as if Elias returning through the stone gate was something both ordinary and deeply important at the same time. A man repairing a wooden fence paused and placed his tools down before nodding respectfully. Two women standing near a garden of late summer vegetables lowered their heads for a moment before continuing their work. Even the children who had been running across the field slowed their steps and stared with wide eyes, whispering softly among themselves. Clara felt a strange mixture of wonder and confusion building inside her chest. Only yesterday, the townspeople of Silver Hollow had laughed at the quiet mountain man she married. They had called him poor. They had called him a wanderer who lived somewhere among the clouds with nothing but an old horse and a weathered cabin. Yet here in this valley, hidden nearly 2 miles above the world she knew, those same people would have been shocked to see how every door opened when Elias passed by. The trail curved gently toward the center of the valley where a larger wooden house stood near a wide open field. The building was simple but strong, built from thick beams of mountain timber with a long porch facing the fields below. Smoke rose slowly from the stone chimney, drifting into the bright afternoon sky. As Elias approached the house, the front door opened and an elderly man stepped outside. His hair was silver and his shoulders slightly bent with age, but his eyes were sharp and steady as he studied the couple walking toward him. The moment he saw Elias clearly, the old man removed his hat and placed it carefully against his chest. The movement was slow and full of meaning. Clara noticed something else then. Across the field, people had begun gathering quietly along the edge of the grass. Farmers, craftsmen, mothers holding small children, and young workers returning from the barns all stopped where they stood. Within a few moments, nearly 100 people were watching the path leading to the house. No one shouted. No one ran forward. They simply waited. Elias finally stopped a few feet from the porch. For a long moment, neither he nor the old man spoke. The wind moved gently through the tall grass, and the distant sound of water flowing through the valley echoed faintly between the hills. Then the old man stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with emotion that had clearly waited many years to be spoken. "Welcome home, Elias Rowan." Clara felt the words settle in the quiet air around them. She turned slowly toward her husband, searching his face for an answer she did not yet understand. Elias looked across the gathered crowd and gave a small nod that seemed to carry far more weight than a simple greeting. The old man turned his eyes toward Clara next, studying her with careful curiosity before speaking again in a softer tone. "And this must be the woman he has chosen. The valley has waited a long time to meet her." Clara stood quietly beside Elias while the old man's words drifted through the valley like a bell echoing across still water. "Welcome home, Elias Rowan." The sentence was simple, yet the way the people gathered across the field reacted made it clear those words carried the weight of many years. Several of them lowered their heads again. Others placed a hand against their chest in the same respectful gesture Clara had noticed before. The wind moved slowly through the tall grass while the afternoon sun dipped lower behind the ridges, casting long golden light across the valley floor. Clara tried to understand what she was seeing. Only 2 days earlier, she had been standing behind the counter of her father's small store in Silver Hollow, measuring flour and counting coins while travelers spoke about weather and wagon repairs. Now she stood nearly 2 miles above that quiet town, surrounded by strangers who greeted her husband as if he belonged to something far larger than a lonely cabin in the mountains. The old man stepped down from the porch and approached them with careful, steady steps. His boots pressed softly into the grass while his eyes remained fixed on Elias with an expression that mixed pride and relief. "You were gone longer than many expected," he said gently. The valley wondered when the path would open again. Elias nodded once, but did not answer immediately. He rested a hand on the horse's saddle, as if considering the words before finally, speaking in a calm voice Clara had only heard a few times before. "The world below the clouds has changed," he said. "It was time for me to see it again." The old man's eyes shifted briefly toward Clara. "And you did not return alone." Elias turned slightly toward his wife then, his expression softening in a way Clara had rarely seen in town. "This is Clara Whitmore," he said simply. The old man studied her carefully, not with suspicion but with a kind of thoughtful curiosity. After a moment, he gave a small respectful nod. "Then the valley has gained more than we expected today." Behind them, the people who had gathered began speaking quietly among themselves. Clara noticed something surprising as she looked across their faces. None of them seemed shocked by her presence. Instead, they watched her with the same calm patience they had shown Elias, as if her arrival had been quietly anticipated long before this day. The old man turned and gestured toward the large house behind him. "You have traveled far. Both of you should rest. The valley will want to welcome you properly before nightfall." Elias hesitated for only a moment before guiding the horse toward the porch. Clara followed beside him, still trying to piece together the truth hidden inside this peaceful valley above the clouds. As they reached the steps, she noticed something carved into the wooden beam above the doorway. The symbol was simple yet striking, a circle surrounded by small mountain peaks. When Elias looked up at it, his expression changed for the first time since they arrived. The quiet mountain man from Silver Hollow was gone in that moment. In his place stood someone who clearly knew this valley far better than he had ever let the world below believe. Clara stepped through the doorway of the large timber house and felt the warmth of a stone fireplace spread across the room. The interior smelled faintly of cedar wood, fresh bread, and the smoke of slow-burning pine logs. Sunlight slipped through tall windows and stretched across a wide wooden table that looked as though it had served generations before this day. Everything inside the house was simple yet carefully built, the kind of place made to last far longer than a single lifetime. Elias guided the horse reins to a wooden post outside the porch and then entered behind Clara, closing the door softly against the cool wind drifting down from the high cliffs. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Clara slowly turned in place, taking in the quiet details around her. Shelves of worn books lined one wall. A large map covered another, the edges marked with hand-drawn trails that curved through the mountains surrounding the valley. She recognized none of the routes. The old man who had greeted them stepped inside as well, removing his hat and placing it on a small wooden hook beside the door. His eyes rested on Elias with the calm patience of someone who had been waiting for this moment for many years. "The valley has continued just as you left it," he said quietly. "The farms have grown. The orchards have survived every winter. But many wondered if the gate would remain closed forever." Elias walked slowly toward the map on the wall. His fingers traced one of the narrow trails drawn across the mountains before stopping near the edge where the valley sat hidden above the clouds. "The world below changes quickly," he said. "Roads appear. Rail lines move closer every year." The old man nodded slowly, understanding the weight behind those words. "And that is why this place was built high above them all." Clara listened carefully, realizing that the conversation unfolding in front of her carried far more meaning than she had yet been told. She stepped closer to the map and studied the valley drawn at the center. It was surrounded by steep ridges and marked by only one narrow path leading through the mountain gate they had entered. "You built a hidden town above the clouds," she said softly, almost to herself. The old man turned toward her with a gentle smile. "Not a town, Miss Whitmore. A refuge." He walked toward the window and looked out across the valley where the golden light of late afternoon rested on fields of tall grass and rows of fruit trees swaying quietly in the wind. Many years ago, a group of families came searching for a place where they could live without the noise and struggle that grows wherever gold or land is discovered. They climbed higher than anyone believed possible and found this valley waiting above the clouds. Clara felt a quiet chill move through her as she watched the peaceful land stretching outside the window. The people she had seen in the fields were not strangers passing through a remote valley. They were the descendants of those first families who had chosen to remain hidden from the changing world below. Elias turned away from the map and looked toward Clara. "There is something else you should understand," he said calmly. "This valley has always belonged to the people who protect it." Clara noticed the old man watching Elias carefully now, his expression thoughtful. Then the old man spoke again, his voice steady but filled with quiet certainty. "And for generations, that responsibility has belonged to the Rowan family." Clara stood quietly near the map, while the old man's final words settled into the warm air of the room. The Rowan family. For a moment she simply looked at Elias, searching his face for the meaning behind that name spoken with such certainty. In Silver Hollow the name Rowan meant very little. It belonged to a quiet man who bought flour once every few months and rode back into the mountains before sunset. But here inside this house above the clouds, the name carried something heavier, something rooted deep in the valley and the generations who had lived here before. Elias walked slowly toward the window and looked out across the valley fields where the evening light had begun to soften into long shadows. Farmers were guiding horses toward the barns. Children ran through the grass while lanterns flickered to life along the paths between homes. It looked peaceful, almost timeless, like a place untouched by the restless movement of the world below the mountains. "My father showed me this valley when I was younger than most of the children you saw outside today," Elias said quietly without turning from the window. His voice carried the calm weight of memory rather than pride. Clara listened closely. In town he had rarely spoken about his past. No one had ever asked many questions either. The old man stepped closer to the large table, resting his hands against the smooth wood as if the story being told belonged to the entire valley. "The Rowan family did not discover this place," he explained gently, "but they were the ones trusted to protect it when the first settlers decided that someone must guard the gate." Clara pictured the stone wall they had passed through only hours earlier, hidden high in the mountains where no traveler would ever think to search for a path. "My father believed the outside world would one day climb higher into these mountains," Elias continued. "Roads would appear where there were none. Prospectors would search every valley for gold. When that day came, the gate would have to remain hidden from anyone who did not belong here." Clara turned slowly toward him. "And that responsibility is yours now," she said softly. Elias nodded once. For a long time he had lived alone among the lower ridges, watching the towns grow slowly across the valley below. The small cabin above Silver Hollow had not been a sign of poverty at all. It had been a watch post, a quiet place where the guardian of a hidden valley could observe the world without drawing attention to himself. The old man studied Clara again with thoughtful eyes. "Your husband chose to see the world below before bringing anyone here. That was his decision to make." Clara felt the truth of that settle in her chest. Elias had not hidden this valley out of shame. He had protected it because the valley had trusted his family to keep its secret safe. Outside the window, the last light of day was fading behind the tall ridges surrounding the valley. Lanterns glowed across the fields like scattered stars resting in the grass. Elias finally turned from the window and looked directly at Clara. "I did not bring you here only to show you where I came from," he said calmly. Clara could see something deeper in his expression now, something that carried both hope and responsibility. "Because if you choose to stay here," he continued quietly, "then this valley will become your home as well." Clara did not answer immediately when Elias finished speaking. She stood near the window of the old timber house, watching the lanterns slowly appear across the valley as evening settled over the high grass and orchards. The light from each home glowed softly against the deep blue sky above the clouds, and for the first time she realized how quiet the valley truly was. No wagon wheels rattling across dirt roads. No merchants shouting prices along a busy street. Only the gentle wind moving through the fields and the distant sound of water flowing through the narrow streams that crossed the valley floor. She thought of Silver Hollow nearly 2 miles below them, where the general store would be closing for the night, and the last riders would be tying their horses outside the saloon before heading home. That life suddenly felt very far away. Clara turned slowly toward Elias, her eyes searching his face with calm curiosity rather than doubt. "You lived alone all those years so that no one would suspect what you were protecting," she said quietly. Elias gave a small nod. "It was easier for the world below to believe I had nothing. People rarely search for secrets in the life of a man they think is poor. The old man standing near the table allowed himself a faint smile at those words. Your father used to say the same thing, he said gently. The safest place for a secret is often hidden in plain sight. Clara walked toward the map again, studying the narrow trails that curved through the mountains surrounding the valley. Now that she understood what the valley truly was, every line on the map seemed more important. Every ridge, every hidden path, every narrow pass through the mountains served as a shield protecting the quiet world above the clouds. And all of it had been guarded by the family of the man she had married only 2 days before. Outside the window, the people of the valley had begun lighting small lanterns along the paths between homes. A few of them were gathering near the large field below the house, carrying baskets and wooden tables as if preparing for something. Clara noticed the movement and turned toward the old man. Are they expecting something tonight? She asked. The old man glanced out the window and nodded slowly. When the gate opens after a long silence, the valley gathers. It has been many years since Elias walked through that mountain passage. Many of the children outside have never seen the guardian of the gate return home. Clara felt a quiet warmth move through her chest at those words. She had spent most of her life believing she understood the man she married. Yet the deeper truth of his life had been waiting patiently in this valley all along. Elias stepped beside her near the window and looked down at the people preparing lanterns and long wooden tables across the field. They are not gathering only for me, he said softly. Clara looked up at him. Then who are they gathering for? She asked. Elias met her eyes with the calm certainty she had begun to recognize in him since the moment the mountain wall opened. They are gathering to welcome the woman who chose to stand beside the guardian of this valley. The field below the house slowly filled with warm lantern light as Clara and Elias stepped out onto the wooden porch. The evening air carried the sweet scent of fruit trees and fresh grass drifting up from the valley floor. Clara paused at the top of the steps, taking in the quiet gathering forming below them. Long wooden tables had been set in rows across the open field, and families were placing baskets of bread, jars of preserves, and pitchers of fresh water beneath. The soft glow of hanging lanterns. The people moved with calm familiarity, greeting one another with smiles and quiet voices that floated gently through the air. No one hurried. No one seemed surprised. It was as though the valley had always known this night would eventually arrive. Elias stood beside Clara with the relaxed posture of a man who had finally returned to a place he understood completely. For years he had watched distant towns grow and change beyond the mountain ridges, but here nothing moved with the restless urgency of the outside world. The old man who had welcomed them earlier walked down the porch steps first and crossed the grass toward the gathering families. One by one the people noticed him approaching and turned their attention toward the house on the hill. Clara felt their eyes slowly lift toward the porch where she and Elias stood together in the lantern glow. There was curiosity in their expressions, but no suspicion. Only quiet interest and patient warmth. Elias glanced toward Clara and offered a small reassuring smile before guiding her down the steps beside him. The grass beneath her boots was soft and cool from the evening air, and the gentle sound of conversation faded as the crowd made space for them to approach the center of the field. A woman carrying a basket of apples stepped forward first. Her hair had begun to turn silver, but her eyes held the bright kindness of someone who had spent a lifetime in peaceful places. "Welcome home, Elias Rowan," she said warmly. Her voice carried across the field just enough for those nearby to hear. Several others nodded in agreement, their faces calm and welcoming. Elias lowered his head slightly in gratitude. "It has been many years," he replied. The woman then turned her attention to Clara, studying her with thoughtful curiosity before offering the basket forward. "And you must be the woman who walked beside him through the mountain gate today." Clara accepted the basket carefully, surprised by the simple kindness in the gesture. The apples were bright red and still cool from the evening air. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said softly. A gentle ripple of recognition moved through the nearby families as the names spread among them. The woman smiled again, clearly pleased. "Then you are already one of us," she said. Clara looked around the lantern lit field where children now sat along the edges of the tables, and older men adjusted the lanterns hanging above them. The valley did not greet her as a stranger from the outside world. They welcomed her as someone whose arrival had long been expected. Elias stepped slightly closer to her side, and looked out across the gathering people. Tonight they will share stories and food the way this valley always has when the guardian returns after many seasons away. Clara studied the peaceful faces around them and felt a quiet realization settle deep within her heart. This hidden valley above the clouds was not simply a refuge protected by the Rowan family. It was a living community waiting patiently for the moment its next chapter would begin. Lantern light swayed gently above the long wooden tables, while the people of the valley settled into their places beneath the wide, open sky. The air had cooled as night rose over the mountain ridges, and the clouds far below had turned into a pale, silver sea reflecting the moonlight. Clara sat beside Elias at the center of the gathering, while families passed baskets of bread, bowls of fresh berries, and warm plates of roasted vegetables down the tables. The meal moved slowly, accompanied by quiet laughter and stories shared in calm voices that carried through the peaceful field. It was not the noisy celebration Clara had expected from a town gathering. Instead, it felt more like a circle of old friends welcoming someone home after a long journey. The woman who had offered Clara the basket of apples earlier now poured fresh cider into simple wooden cups and passed one toward her with a gentle smile. "The orchard harvest was strong this year," she said warmly. Clara accepted the cup and tasted the sweet cider, surprised by how fresh it felt compared to anything sold in Silver Hollow. She looked across the field where children now sat in small groups listening to an older man tell a quiet story beside a lantern hung from a wooden post. Their faces glowed softly in the light, while the mountains formed dark outlines against the stars above. "It feels like the world moves slower here," Clara said quietly to Elias. Elias watched the people around them with calm familiarity. "Up here the valley keeps its own rhythm," he replied. "The seasons guide most decisions, rather than the noise of distant towns." Clara followed his gaze across the field. The people of the valley seemed deeply connected to the land around them, moving through their work and their conversations with quiet patience. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing felt forced. The old man who had greeted them at the house earlier stood slowly from his seat at the far end of the table. As he did, the nearby conversations began to quiet until the field settled into a respectful silence. He rested one hand against the table and looked out at the gathered families. "For many years this valley has continued its quiet life, while the guardian of our gate watched over the mountains beyond," he said calmly. "Tonight that guardian has returned." Several heads turned toward Elias, though there was no loud applause or cheering. Instead, the people nodded with the calm recognition of something long expected finally taking its place again. The old man continued speaking with steady warmth. "But tonight we also welcome someone who has chosen to walk beside him into the valley we have protected for generations." Clara felt every eye slowly turn toward her now, not with pressure, but with open curiosity. The old man smiled kindly. "The valley does not ask for loyalty with promises or rewards," he said. "It asks only for patience and respect for the quiet life that has been built here above the clouds." Clara held the wooden cup in her hands and looked across the lantern-lit field. The gentle wind carried the scent of orchards and distant pine forests drifting down from the slopes beyond the valley. For the first time she understood what Elias had protected all these years. The old man lifted his cup slightly toward her. "Clara Whitmore," he said softly, "tonight you are welcome not as a guest, but as someone who now shares the future of this valley." The lantern light shimmered softly across the long tables as the valley settled into a deeper quiet after the old man finished speaking. Clara still held the wooden cup in her hands, feeling the warmth of the cider against the cool night air. Around her the people returned slowly to their meals and quiet conversations, yet there was a subtle change now. Some of the older residents watched her with thoughtful expressions, as though studying the woman who had stepped into a story that had been unfolding in the valley long before she was born. Elias sat beside her with the calm stillness that had first drawn her curiosity back in Silver Hollow. He did not seem surprised by the attention. Instead, he simply looked across the lantern-lit field as if he had known this moment would arrive one day. Clara leaned slightly closer to him, her voice low so only he could hear. "Did you always know they would accept me this way?" she asked gently. Elias shook his head once. "The valley accepts people slowly," he replied, "but it respects honest choices. You chose to walk through the gate. That matters here." Clara looked again toward the families gathered around them. A group of children had begun chasing one another near the edge of the field, while several older men adjusted the lanterns hanging above the tables. The scene felt so natural that it was difficult to believe the entire valley existed hidden from the world only a few miles away. The old man who had spoken earlier slowly approached their table again and took a seat across from them. His eyes carried the calm patience of someone who had witnessed many seasons pass across this land. "Elias," he said quietly, "the lower valleys have grown busier in recent years. Travelers pass closer to the mountains every summer." Clara noticed Elias nod slightly, as if he had expected this conversation. "I have seen the same changes from the ridges below," he answered. The old man folded his hands together on the table. "Then the time has come for the guardian to return fully to the valley." Clara sensed the deeper meaning behind those words. For years Elias had remained between two worlds, living quietly near the lower mountains while still protecting the secret path above. But the outside world was moving closer. Roads would eventually reach places that had once been forgotten. She looked toward the dark outline of the mountain wall rising beyond the valley fields. Somewhere within those cliffs lay the narrow gate that kept this peaceful place hidden from wandering travelers. Elias rested his hands calmly on the table. "If I remain here, someone else will need to watch the lower ridges," he said thoughtfully. The old man nodded slowly. "That is a conversation the valley will have in time. Tonight is simply the beginning of your return." Clara listened to them carefully, realizing that the quiet celebration around her marked more than a homecoming. It marked the moment when the future of the hidden valley would begin to shift. Elias finally turned toward her again, his expression calm but thoughtful. "Life here will not always be as quiet as tonight," he said softly. Clara looked out across the lanterns glowing under the wide, open sky, and then back at him with steady confidence. "I did not climb through the clouds expecting an easy life," she replied gently. "I came because I trust the man who guards this valley." The lanterns burned lower as the night deepened above the hidden valley, their soft golden light swaying gently with the mountain wind that drifted down from the tall ridges. Most of the children had grown quiet now, sitting beside their parents or dozing against the warm shoulders of older siblings while the adults continued their slow conversations across the long wooden tables. Clara remained seated beside Elias, her eyes drifting across the peaceful field as she listened to the steady rhythm of voices and laughter blending softly into the cool evening air. It felt as though the valley itself breathed slowly beneath the stars, untouched by the restless pace of the distant world below the mountains. Elias stood after a moment and offered his hand to her without speaking. Clara accepted it and followed him away from the tables, their footsteps carrying them across the soft grass toward the edge of the orchard, where rows of fruit trees stretched quietly into the moonlight. Behind them the lanterns continued to glow like scattered stars resting along the field. When they reached the first line of trees, Elias paused and looked back across the valley. From this distance the homes appeared as small pockets of light resting beneath the dark slopes that surrounded them. For generations the valley had remained hidden here above the clouds, protected not by walls or weapons, but by distance, patience, and trust. Clara followed his gaze and felt the same quiet weight settle in her thoughts. "The world below will not stay small forever," she said gently. Elias nodded once. He had spent many seasons watching that truth unfold from the high ridges. New trails appeared each year. Traders and settlers traveled farther into the mountains than they once had. The land that once seemed unreachable slowly became closer to the reach of curious travelers. "The valley knew this day would come eventually," he said. "That is why my father believed the guardian must live between two worlds for a time." Clara studied his face carefully in the soft moonlight filtering through the orchard leaves. "And now that time is ending," she said quietly. Elias rested one hand against the rough bark of the nearest tree and looked toward the narrow ridges where the hidden gate lay somewhere beyond the dark cliffs. "The valley can remain hidden only if someone continues to watch the lower mountains," he explained. "Someone who understands both the world below and the life protected here." Clara understood the meaning behind his words before he spoke them fully. The responsibility that had belonged to his family for generations would not disappear simply because he had returned home. It would grow. The old man had said the valley would speak about its future in time, but Clara sensed that the quiet conversation had already begun the moment she and Elias stepped through the mountain gate together. She reached for Elias's hand again and held it gently while the wind moved through the orchard branches above them. "Then we will face that future together," she said calmly. Elias looked at her for a long moment before turning his gaze back across the lantern-lit valley below. In the quiet glow of the night, it felt as though the hidden kingdom above the clouds had finally found the two people who would carry its story into the years still waiting ahead. Morning arrived quietly above the clouds as the first pale light of dawn slipped across the mountain ridges surrounding the valley. The lanterns from the celebration had long since burned out, leaving only thin trails of smoke rising gently into the cool morning air. Clara stood near the edge of the orchard where she and Elias had spoken the night before, watching the sunlight slowly spill across the open fields below. From this height, the clouds stretched across the horizon like a calm white ocean, while the valley itself rested like an island of green above the sky. One by one the homes began to stir awake. A farmer stepped from his doorway and walked toward the barn with a quiet stretch of his shoulders. A pair of children ran across the grass, chasing a small dog that darted between the rows of apple trees. The valley was waking the way it always had, slowly and without hurry. Clara breathed in the crisp mountain air and felt the calm rhythm of the place settle deep inside her chest. Footsteps approached softly behind her, and Elias joined her beneath the orchard branches, carrying 2 tin cups filled with warm coffee. He handed one to her and stood beside her without speaking for a moment, both of them watching the valley begin another peaceful day. The clouds below shifted gently as sunlight climbed higher over the ridges. "It is strange," Clara said quietly, "how something hidden can feel more real than the towns we left behind." Elias smiled faintly at her words. "This valley has had many years to learn patience," he replied. "The world below moves fast because it is always chasing something. Up here, the people learned long ago that some things are worth protecting simply because they exist." Clara looked across the fields where several families had already begun their morning work, moving through the orchards and gardens with the steady confidence of people who belonged to the land they cared for. She thought about the narrow mountain gate hidden inside the cliffs and the generations of guardians who had quietly watched over it. The responsibility had never been about power or control. It had always been about preserving a place where life could continue peacefully above the noise of the outside world. Elias rested his hands along the wooden fence beside them and studied the valley with calm understanding. The Rowan family had guarded this place for many years, but the valley itself had always belonged to the people who lived and worked within it. Clara sipped the warm coffee and allowed herself a quiet smile. "And now it belongs to the future as well," she said gently. Elias turned his head slightly toward her, and for the first time since they had climbed through the hidden gate, there was a lightness in his expression. The valley had waited through many seasons for this moment when its story would continue with new voices and new choices guiding the years ahead. The wind moved softly through the orchard leaves above them, while the morning sun warmed the fields below. Clara and Elias stood together watching the hidden valley wake beneath the rising light, knowing that far below the clouds the world would continue to rush forward as it always had. But here above the mountains something rare had endured, a quiet kingdom hidden in the sky. A place protected not by walls or secrets alone, but by the simple promise that some homes are worth climbing above the clouds to find.